I never imagined my life could be turned upside down so suddenly and so painfully, as if someone had ripped the ground out from under me and left me standing in nothing. For 17 years, I was sure I had everything in place and nothing could disrupt our familiar rhythm. A loving husband by my side, a beautiful daughter growing up in warmth and care, and a marriage I considered strong, almost unshakable. My name is Isabella, and if someone had told me before that the people closest to me could turn into strangers in a single day, I would have simply smiled and waved it off because I so sincerely believed it was impossible. But everything turned out differently, and this story began not with loud events, but with quiet cracks that I refused to notice for too long. At that time, my life flowed along a familiar channel, measured and predictable, like a river that hasn't changed its course for years. I worked as an accountant for a trading company, and although my job was never particularly exciting, the numbers and reports felt like reliable companions. They weren't deceiving, they were always accurate, and that gave me a sense of stability. My business helped us stay afloat, pay bills, buy Sarah the books she loved to read at night, and save a little for the future. My husband Mark was a sales representative for a large company, and his job required constant travel, so he was often absent. Over the years of marriage, I grew accustomed to these absences. At first, they seemed like torture. I missed him to tears. But over time, they became a kind of background, part of our family picture, and I even found my own special rhythm in them, a warm ritual of anticipation. I prepared his favorite dishes for his arrival, making the meeting special. I loved imagining him walking through the door, inhaling the scent of fresh bread and roast chicken, and smiling in the way only he could. Sarah was 15 then, already beginning to look like a grown woman, and I often caught myself thinking that she had absorbed the best of both of us, Mark's easy charm and my persistence. She filled the house with energy. Her laughter echoed through the rooms. Her music boomed from the bedroom. Her questions, sometimes sharp and adult, made me feel how quickly time flew. We lived in a small but cozy apartment where everything reminded me of our years together, and I sincerely believed we were happy, although now, looking back, I realize how naive I was to think that a feeling of contentment could last forever. "When are you coming back this time?" I asked Mark on the phone during his latest trip. It was a familiar conversation, one we'd had dozens of times before, and there was nothing unusual about it, except for one detail that I only caught later. "Should be home by Thursday," he replied with a certain detachment in his voice, adding, "Don't worry, no need to cook anything special." This phrase should have alerted me, since Mark always adored my cooking, especially after a long absence, and for him, returning home was usually associated with the smells of the kitchen and our evening conversations over dinner. But then I just chuckled, thinking he was tired, and didn't pay any attention. I began to notice something had changed in his behavior lately, something subtle and elusive, as if a barely perceptible coolness had appeared in the air. He returned from business trips a different man, absent-minded, thoughtful, almost cold. When he walked through the door, he no longer rushed to embrace me like he used to, but seemed to glide past, barely glancing at the laid table. The food I prepared with love no longer evoked the same response in him that it always had. "Are you okay?" I asked more than once, trying to catch his eyes, to find the familiar warmth there. "You seem different." He usually brushed it off. "Just tired from work." "It's nothing." I tried to believe these words because everyone around me kept saying that men in their 40s go through some kind of change, that it's a midlife crisis, and I convinced myself that I just needed to give him time and space. I believed that everything would fall into place if only I waited. Sarah noticed this too, although we both avoided saying it out loud. "Mom, Dad's been acting weird lately," she said one evening as we washed the dishes. I gave a tight smile and replied, "He's just stressed at work, honey." It happens. Sometimes there are times in a marriage when everything seems more difficult. I tried to believe my own words. It made it easier to breathe. I never imagined my life could be turned upside down so suddenly and so painfully, as if someone had ripped the ground out from under me and left me standing in nothing. For 17 years, I was sure I had everything in place, and nothing could disrupt our familiar rhythm. A loving husband by my side, a beautiful daughter growing up in warmth and care, and a marriage I considered strong, almost unshakable. My name is Isabella, and if someone had told me before that the people closest to me could turn into strangers in a single day, I would have simply smiled and waved it off, because I so sincerely believed it was impossible. But everything turned out differently, and this story began not with loud events, but with quiet cracks that I refused to notice for too long. At that time, my life flowed along a familiar channel, measured and predictable, like a river that hasn't changed its course for years. I worked as an accountant for a trading company, and although my job was never particularly exciting, the numbers and reports felt like reliable companions. They weren't deceiving, they were always accurate, and that gave me a sense of stability. My business helped us stay afloat, pay bills, buy Sarah the books she loved to read at night, and save a little for the future. My husband Mark was a sales representative for a large company, and his job required constant travel, so he was often absent. Over the years of marriage, I grew accustomed to these absences. At first, they seemed like torture. I missed him to tears. But over time, they became a kind of background, part of our family picture, and I even found my own special rhythm in them, a warm ritual of anticipation. I prepared his favorite dishes for his arrival, making the meeting special. I loved imagining him walking through the door, inhaling the scent of fresh bread and roast chicken, and smiling in the way only he could. Sarah was 15 then, already beginning to look like a grown woman, and I often caught myself thinking that she had absorbed the best of both of us, Mark's easy charm and my persistence. She filled the house with energy. Her laughter echoed through the rooms. Her music boomed from the bedroom. Her questions, sometimes sharp and adult, made me feel how quickly time flew. We lived in a small but cozy apartment where everything reminded me of our years together, and I sincerely believed we were happy. Although now, looking back, I realize how naive I was to think that a feeling of contentment could last forever. "When are you coming back this time?" I asked Mark on the phone during his latest trip. It was a familiar conversation, one we'd had dozens of times before, and there was nothing unusual about it, except for one detail that I only caught later. "Should be home by Thursday," he replied with a certain detachment in his voice, adding, "Don't worry, no need to cook anything special." This phrase should have alerted me, since Mark always adored my cooking, especially after a long absence, and for him, returning home was usually associated with the smells of the kitchen and our evening conversations over dinner. But then I just chuckled, thinking he was tired and didn't pay any attention. I began to notice something had changed in his behavior lately, something subtle and elusive, as if a barely perceptible coolness had appeared in the air. He returned from business trips a different man, absent-minded, thoughtful, almost cold. When he walked through the door, he no longer rushed to embrace me like he used to, but seemed to glide past, barely glancing at the laid table. The food I prepared with love no longer evoked the same response in him that it always had. "Are you okay?" I asked more than once, trying to catch his eyes, to find the familiar warmth there. "You seem different." He usually brushed it off. "Just tired from work." "It's nothing." I tried to believe these words because everyone around me kept saying that men in their 40s go through some kind of change, that it's a midlife crisis, and I convinced myself that I just needed to give him time and space. I believed that everything would fall into place, if only I waited. Sarah noticed this too, although we both avoided saying it out loud. "Mom, Dad's been acting weird lately," she said one evening as we washed the dishes. I gave a tight smile and replied, "He's just stressed at work, honey." It happens. Sometimes there are times in a marriage when everything seems more difficult. I tried to believe my own words. It made it easier to breathe. I focused on being the perfect wife, thinking that if I cooked better, took better care of the house, and tended to it even more attentively, everything would return to normal. But life has a way of shattering our illusions, especially when we're least prepared to admit the truth. I remember that Tuesday, such a seemingly ordinary evening, when I returned home from work, threw my bag on a chair, and still fully undressed, sank onto the sofa in our living room, stretching out my legs tiredly and turning on my phone to check my social media messages, as I did every evening. I expected to see the usual birthday greetings from a friend or cute pictures shared by colleagues, but among the dozens of mundane notifications, there was one strange one, from a stranger. My first reaction was to simply scroll past it and not open it, because you never know who might be writing, but something inside, maybe anxiety, maybe simple curiosity, made me click. "Hi, Isabella," the message began. I read it once, then twice, and the words seemed to ring in my ears, because then came the phrase, "I think it's time we talked." I'm your husband's second wife. My hands immediately began to shake, my heart sank, and my breathing hitched as if someone were squeezing my chest. I kept reading, unable to tear myself away, and each new word was like a knife stab. I've been dating Mark for 3 years. We have a beautiful son, the child he always wanted. My vision blurred, but I couldn't stop because the lines were seared into my consciousness. I'm young and beautiful, and I make him happy in a way you never could. I felt physically ill, but my phone seemed chained to this nightmare. I scrolled further and saw screenshots, dozens of messages between Mark and this woman, revealing the disgusting truth. There were his words, cold, as if written by a stranger, though I recognized every letter, every familiar intonation. "I can't look at her anymore," he wrote. "She's gotten so fat. She's disgusting in bed, like lying next to a log." Tears blurred my vision, and I could barely make out the words, but I couldn't tear myself away because what followed was even worse. "Her cooking makes me vomit. The house is stuffy and unbearable, and if it weren't for Sarah, I would have left years ago." And the last sentence from that woman was like a slap in the face. "If you have any pride left, Isabella, you'll let him go. He doesn't love you anymore. He hasn't loved you for a long time." Everything spun before my eyes. The walls seemed to be falling. I tried to get up from the couch, but my legs gave out, and the last thing I heard was the dull thud of my phone hitting the floor before everything plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, Sarah's worried face was leaning over me, her voice thick as cotton wool. "Mom, can you hear me? I'm calling an ambulance." I tried to protest, to whisper that I was okay, but the words came out with difficulty, slurred and weak. The paramedics arrived anyway, checked my vital signs, and I sat on the couch, shaking and pale, with Sarah holding my hand tightly, as if trying to keep me alive. And then Mark appeared. He walked into the living room with a worried expression and asked, "What happened?" His voice briefly tinged with concern, but when he saw my phone lying on the table, open to those messages, everything changed. "Is it true?" I whispered, looking him straight in the eyes, and at that moment I prayed for a miracle, that he would at least try to deny it all, that he would say it was a fake, a mistake, a cruel prank. But he didn't even try. His face turned stony, alien, and he said quietly but firmly, "Yes. I don't love you anymore, Isabella. I haven't loved you for a long time. I want a divorce." Sarah, who had been sitting next to me the whole time, froze, her fingers squeezing my hand even tighter, her voice trembling with rage. "How could you do this to Mom? How could you?" Mark just looked away and said, "I'm sorry you found out this way," and walked out of the room, leaving us among the rubble of what used to be a family. The next few weeks passed in a thick fog. I moved mechanically, got up, made breakfast, went to work, came home, but inside I felt empty. I felt like a child in the body of a grown woman, lost, homeless. Sarah became my only support during this period. She stayed with me despite Mark's attempts to convince her to live with him, and it was her presence that saved me from complete collapse. Mark agreed to pay child support without argument, and it was probably the only decent thing he did during that entire time. Time marched on inexorably, as it always does, and before I knew it, Sarah was standing on the threshold of adulthood, graduating high school and choosing her path for the future. Mark and I, despite the cold gulf that separated us, agreed to split her college tuition equally, and there was a certain ironic clarity to it. We could no longer remain husband and wife, couldn't even stand each other in the same room, but for our daughter's sake, we maintained the illusion of civilized communication, like two diplomats from warring countries, ordered to smile during negotiations. All that united us was the desire for a better future for Sarah. She chose a college in a different city, and at first it seemed like a bright and fitting choice. I remember her calls, full of joy and inspiration. She talked about her classes, how she met her roommates, how she went to her first frat party, how she tasted freedom. I lived for these calls, awaited them, clung to every detail of her new life like a lifeline, because her voice gave me the strength to carry on. But gradually the calls became less frequent, her stories became more fragmented, and increasingly, when I tried to contact her, I was met with the cold whisper of a text message. "Sorry, Mom, I have a study group. Let's talk next week." "Mom, I'm busy later." Each excuse was like a silent punch to the gut, but I convinced myself that it was supposed to be that way, that she was simply busy with student life, that it was normal. But the weeks turned into months, and Sarah almost stopped coming home. One evening, when the loneliness became especially loud, I decided to open her social media page. At first, everything seemed familiar. Photos with classmates, selfies with friends, jokes about sleepless nights before exams. But then my gaze fell on my friends list, and my heart stopped. There was a face I recognized instantly. Lisa, the very woman who had ruined my marriage. My fingers trembled, but I clicked on her profile, and a feed opened before me that made my blood run cold. Dozens of photos, dozens of smiles, and in each one there was Sarah, radiant, happy, hugging her father, standing next to Lisa and their little son. The captions cut to the heart. Finally reunited. Family time is the best time. In every photo, they looked like one big, happy family, the one that should have been mine, but had been erased, as if I had never existed. My insides twisted, and I felt sick and despairing. All her excuses, all her missed visits, it all became clear in one moment. She had been with them all along. With trembling hands, I took screenshots and sent them to Sarah, then called, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the dial tone. She answered on the third call, and before I could say anything, her voice, cold and alien, interrupted me. "I was wondering when you'd find out." "Why, Sarah?" "Why didn't you say anything?" I blurted out, barely able to keep my voice from sobbing. "Because they're fun, Mom. They're rich. They're interesting. Dad and Lisa took me shopping. I have designer clothes now. He bought me a car for my birthday. And what can you offer? A boring apartment and your boring life?" Her words cut deeper than any knife. "I'm your mother, Sarah. I raised you. I gave you everything," I whispered. She interrupted me abruptly. "Yes, but I'm old enough to decide for myself who I spend my time with. Lisa gives me money when I need it. They take me on vacation. If you don't like it, that's your problem." I sat in my quiet apartment staring at the phone through tears and felt the world crumble for the second time. First Mark, now Sarah. The two people I loved most in the world both chose her, a young, beautiful, rich woman who took everything from me. I curled up on the couch and sobbed like I'd never sobbed before, feeling like the loneliest woman in the world. And at that moment, I desperately, almost painfully, needed someone to talk to, anyone who could hear me, anyone who could hold me in this emptiness. That's when, for the first time in years, I remembered my father, whom I hadn't seen for almost 15 years, after that terrible fight that tore us apart, all because of Mark. Dad saw right through him, warning me again and again that this man wasn't who he claimed to be. But I, blinded by love and stubbornness, refused to listen. "He's not right for you, Isabella. There's something wrong with him. Dad said, looking at me intensely and heavily, and I screamed back, barely holding back tears. You just don't want me to be happy. You never supported my choice. Those were the last words we exchanged before I ran out of his house, leaving behind the scent of familiar walls and the warmth of his voice, choosing Mark over my father. The irony of it all, years later, made me laugh bitterly through my tears. He was right. He'd been right all along, and I, proud and stubborn, had pushed him away. With trembling fingers, I dialed his number, not even believing he could still act after so many years of silence. The ringing continued painfully until suddenly a familiar voice rang out. Hello? It was the same, slightly hoarse, calm, confident. Dad, my voice wavered. I could barely get the words out. This is Isabella. I wanted to know. Can we talk? And he, without a single pause, without reproach, without any recollection of the past, replied, Come right now. I'll send you the gate code. Gate code? The thought sounded strange as I drove along the familiar road to my childhood home, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Our modest home, once filled with shabby chairs and where Mom cooked on an old stove, had been transformed into a stunning estate. Tall, guarded gates greeted me, and the driveway led to a house at least 3 times its size, with sparkling windows, manicured lawns, and gleaming facades. I paused before the door, and there stood Dad. His hair had grayed far more than I remembered, but his eyes were still the same, warm and kind. Welcome home, sweetheart, he said, opening his arms. Pointing to the house, I simply exhaled. Dad, is this all yours? He smiled proudly and replied, A lot can happen in 15 years. Come in, I'll explain everything over coffee. We entered the kitchen, which I remembered as small and cramped, but now revealed a veritable kingdom. A spacious room with appliances I could only dream of, gleaming countertops, and enormous windows. There, over a cup of aromatic coffee, Dad told me how he'd built a real estate empire from scratch, starting with 1 property and gradually growing the business to 30, both residential and commercial. Turns out your old man had a knack for it after all, he said with a slight smile. Then it was my turn to speak. I opened my heart and told him everything, about Mark's betrayal, about his new wife and their son, about how Sarah had turned her back on me for their wealth, and by the end I was sobbing in his arms like a little girl. I'm so sorry, Dad. You were right about Mark. I should have listened to you, I whispered through my tears. He stroked my hair and quietly replied, I forgave you a long time ago, darling. I'm so glad you're home again. From that day on, I began visiting him regularly. It was as if we were making up for lost time. We talked about everything, his business, my broken life, our shared regrets. And one evening, as we sat on his spacious terrace overlooking the city lights, he said something unexpected. Come work for me. I need a good accountant I can trust, someone who can learn the business from the ground up. I froze, in disbelief. Dad, I don't know anything about real estate. He smiled and replied, I'll teach you. You're smart, Isabella. You always have been. And maybe... He paused, looking at me intently. Maybe this will help you take your mind off everything else. And he was right. Immersing myself in a new endeavor was exactly what I needed. We started with the basics. Dad showed me how to value property, how to negotiate contracts, how to analyze the market. Each new detail seemed challenging but exciting, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive again, that my days had meaning. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me truly come alive, as if after a long, cold sleep, I suddenly felt the warmth of the sun on my skin again. Now every number, every equation, and every strategy made sense and challenged me, forcing my brain to work in a way I never had before. My previous accounting job, which had been my mainstay for years, seemed dull and breathless in comparison. Monotonous reports, soulless spreadsheets, endless audits. Here, I was learning not just to count other people's money, but to build entire plans, anticipate market movements, and make decisions that affected dozens of people. Those 3 years flew by surprisingly quickly, because every day I was immersed in a world where I once again felt needed and powerful. But I still returned from time to my old habit, checking Sarah's social media. I knew I was just tearing myself apart, but I couldn't help myself, like a masochist seeking pain. And that's how I found out she was graduating. Not from her, not from a call, not from an invitation, but from photos and publications. I wasn't invited to the ceremony. Instead, I received a short, cold message. Don't come to graduation. Lisa says she'll be embarrassed. Those words cut me like a knife, even though I'd long since gotten used to being stabbed by my own daughter. She made it clear that her new family was her father's family, not me. I saw the photographs. Sarah beaming in her gown and with her diploma, between Mark and Lisa, as if I'd never existed. Her half-brother sat on Mark's shoulders, just as happy and proud, and the captions under the pictures were a mocking one. The perfect family celebration. My heart sank painfully as I looked at these images, realizing that I wasn't even on the edge of this picture, that all their joy was built on my absence. One evening, Dad invited me to dinner. Something in his voice struck me as unusual. It was quieter than usual, and I hadn't heard a particular seriousness in it before. We dined, and afterward, he led me to his office, the very one where every object spoke of his strength and success. "Sit down, dear," he said, carefully lowering himself into the leather chair, and I immediately sensed that something important was about to happen. "I need to tell you something," he began, and my heart sank at his tone. What happened? Dad? I could barely breathe. He looked straight at me and quietly said, "I've been sick for a while now." "Cancer? I've been fighting it for 3 years." His voice wavered, but his eyes remained firm. "The doctors say I don't have much time left." The world seemed to flip on its axis in that moment. The walls seemed to sway, and I grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" My voice broke. He smiled sadly. "Because I had work to do. I needed to prepare you for running the business. That's why I brought you here back then. I knew I didn't have much time, and I needed to teach you everything." I fell to my knees next to his chair, grabbed his hand, and begged, "Dad, no! Please don't say that." He squeezed my hand in his, tightly, firmly, and said quietly, "Hey, don't cry, honey. We've been together for the last 3 years. We've reconciled, and that's all I wanted. I wanted to know that we've mended our relationship, and now I can go peacefully." He passed away 3 months later. I organized the funeral myself, trying to honor his memory as best I could, even as the pain of his loss tore me apart. I sent Sarah a message. "Your grandfather has passed away. The funeral is Saturday. Please come." The reply came quickly, and it hit me harder than I could have imagined. Why should I care about some old man? Dad says he was disgusting. Either way, I'm not interested. I stared at the screen for a long time, completely perplexed. The man she'd rejected was ready to welcome her back into his life. He'd asked about her so often, kept her photo on his desk, and now she couldn't even show a shred of human respect for his memory. The funeral was beautiful, and many people attended. Dad's partners, friends, and colleagues. I stood before the assembled crowd and delivered a speech, summoning all the strength I could muster, even though everything inside was crumbling. Sarah's absence was like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. After the funeral, an inheritance arrived. The house I grew up in, now a mansion, was now mine. The company I'd learned to manage side by side with my father also passed into my hands. All the real estate he'd accumulated and developed over so many years became part of my life. His legacy, his work, his name, his dream, was now mine. And all the things Mark and Lisa used to boast about, their cars, their jewelry, their vacations, seemed insignificant in comparison. But I didn't need a mansion. I didn't need to live among walls too heavy with memories. Instead, I told my assistant at the company to add the house to our rental property portfolio so it would generate income and remain part of the business, not my personal past. I stayed in my apartment, which over this time had become a true fortress for me and a reflection of who I truly am. I completely renovated it the way I'd always dreamed. Every room bore the imprint of my desires and taste, and within these walls I finally felt at home, not a temporary guest. Over the years, my neighbors had become almost like family to me. We'd share news in the hallway, treat each other to baked goods, help each other out when needed, and I knew that this place, though small, was warm and vibrant, and ideal for running the business that had now become my purpose. 2 years passed calmly, measuredly, as if time itself had decided to grant me a respite, and my business flourished under my leadership, growing, strengthening, expanding. But all this couldn't fill the void in my personal life, the void left by the absence of the person I'd once loved more than anything in the world and whom I'd missed so much. And then suddenly the phone rang and Sarah's number appeared on the screen. "Mom," she said without greeting, her voice dry and confident, "I'm getting married. We'll come over next week to talk about it. Jake wants to meet you." I froze, feeling a strange mixture of emotions, but said nothing in response, only exhaling, "Okay, I'll wait." True to her word, Sarah arrived the following week with her fiancé. I watched her enter my apartment, so beautiful and mature, but her eyes immediately began to sweep my living room with a look in which I detected barely concealed disdain. "Same old place," she muttered, running her finger along my coffee table as if checking for dust. "Still living in boredom and poverty." I get it. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I bit my tongue, not wanting to give her any more reason for ridicule. I turned my attention to Jake, who seemed uncomfortable with her words, and went into the kitchen to make coffee and lay out the pastries I'd bought for their arrival. "Tell me about your wedding plans," I said, trying to keep my voice even, and Sarah seemed to change. She sat up straighter, perked up, and spoke with a sparkle in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. "We're planning something spectacular, Mom. Only the best venues in town will do. The ceremony is in 6 months. "That's wonderful," I nodded. "Have you found a venue yet?" Jake politely interjected, "We're looking for something truly special." Sarah cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "Mom, that's actually why we're here. Weddings are expensive, you understand." I nodded. "Of course I understand. I'd be happy to help. I can contribute $10,000. Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically. "Well, I suppose it's better than nothing. Lisa's already promised to take care of my dress and my honeymoon." I nodded silently, though my heart sank painfully, because even then she was comparing me to the woman who had ruined my marriage. They didn't stay long. When the door closed behind them, I sank onto the sofa and considered the irony of it all. I, who now ran a huge company, could easily finance 10 such weddings without batting an eye. But her attitude, her constant nagging, her caustic remarks about my poverty and boring life held me back from revealing the truth. "We'll see what happens," I muttered under my breath. I waited for the wedding invitation, checking my mail every day, but there were no envelopes. Finally, curiosity overcame my pride. I visited Sarah's social media page. There was a long post about her ideal ceremony location. My heart pounded when I read the name of the venue. She had chosen the Grand Plaza, one of the most prestigious wedding and celebration venues in the city, and I knew it better than anyone because I owned it. Her post sparkled with the words, "Jake and I have found the most amazing venue for our wedding. The Grand Plaza is simply perfect, so elegant and exclusive. All that's left is to sign the lease and everything will be ready." I couldn't help but smile. Sarah had no idea that her poor mother, whom she despised, owned this very hall, the very symbol of luxury and wealth that she always held above all else. She chose it precisely because she believed I could never provide her with such a thing. The truth was, luxury, elegance, and wealth had long been within my grasp, but I never bragged about them. The week after Sarah came to me with Jake dragged on in a blur, and when she reappeared on my doorstep, alone, her face was so cold, as if all the years we'd shared had meant nothing, and her eyes held not a trace of the softness I'd secretly hoped to see. "Mom, I need to tell you something," she said, standing in the middle of my living room, not even bothering to sit down, as if her words didn't deserve the slightest warmth. "I'm not inviting you to the wedding," she said, staring straight into my eyes, and in that moment I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 tiny pieces. But my face remained still. I mustered all my willpower not to let her see the pain. "Why don't you look back?" she continued, waving her hand dismissively around the room. "The wedding will be in a magnificent hall. Important people will be there. Jake's family, my father's business partners, Lisa's friends, and you." Her gaze slid down me, coldly appraising. "You're too simple, too poor. You wouldn't fit in." Every word she said struck me like a whip, but she, as if enjoying it, added at the door, "But hey, you can still send a gift. Cash is best. I'll text you with my card details." And the door slammed shut, leaving a resounding silence behind. I sat motionless for a long time, as if turned to stone, and then slowly picked up the phone and dialed my office number. A week later, I walked into the administrative office of the Grand Plaza, the very hotel where her wedding was to take place. Sarah, Jake, and his parents sat at the large table, their faces alight with anticipation, while my property manager prepared to sign the lease. Sarah was beaming, her eyes sparkling with pleasure. She seemed happy until she noticed me. "Mom?" Her voice wavered, and her jaw literally dropped. "What are you doing here?" I smiled and sank into the leather chair opposite, feeling a warmth of confidence coursing through me for the first time in years. "The Grand Plaza is mine, Sarah," I said calmly, "as are several other luxury establishments in the city. In fact," I gestured around the room, "the entire company managing this property is mine." Sarah paled, then her face flushed, and then, as if a switch had flipped inside her, her eyes took on that calculating glint I'd recognized all those years ago when she'd chosen Lisa and Mark over me. "Wait," she said, stammering, but quickly recovering. "If all this is yours, then I'm your sole heir. You must give me the hall for free, and a wedding gift, maybe one of the apartments." I couldn't help but laugh, a low, hard laugh, unlike anything I'd heard in a long time. "Actually, Sarah, I came here personally to reject your lease application," I said, standing up, gathering the papers from the table. "You can't do that," she screamed, jumping to her feet. "I can," I replied evenly, looking her straight in the eye, and I did. "I suggest you find another place. And you know what, Sarah?" I stopped at the door and turned around. "Maybe you should consider whether it's worth ruining relationships with people who truly love you just because they don't seem rich or important enough." "But Mom!" Her cry echoed down the hallway as she followed me, her heels clicking on the marble, echoing, her voice growing louder and more desperate. "You can't do this to me. I'm your daughter. Mom!" But I kept walking, the click of my own heels on the cold floor drowning out her protests. And for the first time in years, I felt truly strong, not because of money, not because of buildings, not because of power, but because I had finally stood up for myself and refused to let anyone, not even my own daughter, humiliate me or dictate my worth. 3 days after our confrontation in the luxurious Grand Plaza, where I finally stood up for myself and my boundaries for the first time in my life, a gold-embossed envelope arrived in my mailbox, shining and heavy, like a small ornament that should have been pleasing to the eye but instead brought only a burden of memories. I tore open the thick paper and pulled out an intricate wedding invitation, so ornate and expensively refined that it seemed its cost could rival a simple worker's weekly salary, or maybe even a month's. And at that very moment, my phone vibrated, its screen flashing almost simultaneously, as if fate itself had decided to emphasize the irony of the situation. The words, "Mom, forgive me for everything," flashed across the screen. I sat there, holding the invitation in one hand, the phone in the other, and my heart was beating so hard you could almost hear it in the quiet apartment. "I treated you terribly," the message continued. "I've thought about it a lot, and now I realize how wrong I was. I'm ready to sever all ties with Dad and Lisa. We don't need them. Please come to my wedding. Please give me another chance." Her words were beautiful. Her apology sounded sincere. And for a moment I even allowed myself to feel a faint glimmer of hope. But something inside me stabbed painfully, like a thin needle, and I realized it wasn't about my forgiveness or my love. This feeling of déjà vu was too strong, as if I'd been down this road before. I slowly placed the invitation on my lap and began typing a reply. "When I chose your dad and Lisa," I wrote, my fingers trembling, "I felt like they offered something better than what I had with Dad. More money, more excitement, more status, and I abandoned someone who loved me unconditionally for a superficial glow. Sound familiar?" I froze, watching 3 dots appear and disappear on the screen, indicating Sarah was writing a reply, erasing it, writing again, and finally her short, "It's not fair, Mom." I really want to make things right, but I already saw clearly. She had once chosen Mark and Lisa because they had money and status. Now that she knew I had money and status, she chose me. It was a pattern, painfully obvious, and I knew. This wasn't repentance. This wasn't love. This was just another calculation. I didn't answer. I put the phone on the table and carefully tucked the invitation away in a drawer next to a framed photograph of my father, where he still looked at me with that soft, calm smile he used to greet me with when I returned after years of silence. The wedding day arrived, but I spent it not in a lavish hall, surrounded by guests and champagne, but in my office, looking out the huge windows at the city my father had built and which I now ruled. I worked, signed documents, took calls, and every move I made was firm and calm because I knew I was in the right place and I was continuing his work. Later, I saw photos online. Sarah had chosen a different location. It was beautiful, but not as prestigious as the Grand Plaza. Although she looked stunning in the photos in a white dress, her smile sometimes seemed forced, as if it concealed fatigue or doubt. I still follow her life from afar, on social media, seeing how her surroundings change. She posts fewer and fewer photos with Mark and Lisa, and there's less of the glitter and gilding she so admired. I suppose even the brightest light fades sooner or later if it's not real. She still occasionally texts me, short messages often asking for help or money, but I've learned to ignore them now, not out of anger or revenge, but because I know the value of words and the value of true feelings. And yet, I haven't lost hope. I understand all too well that the road to understanding can be long and difficult. It took me 15 years to truly understand what I did to my father when I abandoned him for an empty sparkle. And only then did I truly understand the depth of my mistake and was able to sincerely regret it. But he waited. He waited patiently all those years and was ready to take me back when I finally understood. Now my role is to wait and be ready for the day, if it ever comes, when Sarah understands that loving someone for who they are is more precious and greater than loving them for what they can give. And if that day does come, I will be ready to open the door for her. In the meantime, I continue to run the company my father entrusted to me, live in my comfortable, albeit modest apartment, and keep his wisdom in my heart. I will leave the door open, not because I am rich or poor, but because I am her mother. And that is the only wealth that cannot be measured by any numbers or any status.